Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Valenzano. I will be doing the training today. And like Giuseppe said, today we're going to go through the basic setup so that you can see how we're not going to do any transactions or any processing, but we're going to go through the setup, and that kind of goes hand in hand with all of the transactions that will occur later. And we'll go through that training later. A couple things with GoldFinch, just want to let you know, when you first install GoldFinch, there are quite a few GoldFinch apps that we have already predefined. You can, of course, create more. We just kind of grouped things together, how we feel things would work. What we're going to look at right now is this GoldFinch setup app. And this is where you have your basic setup when you're first kind of getting started. The first thing we want to do when you get started is I'm going to go into company setup here. You can have multiple companies. If you do, you would have them all listed here and you would create a new record. This is where you can enter in a lot of default information for how the company is going to run and how the setup and configuration is going to happen within GoldFinch. So if I open this up here, you can see basic address information. We have a spot for a logo. This all stuff by default in this detail section, some of it will print on documents. So you can upload a logo and that'll automatically print on your purchase order, your sales invoice, whatever, documents you have by default. And that's where this address is coming from as well. This is the main address of the company. What we also have is here, there's a section of defaults. And these are kind of default setup that you would utilize. We have some different things, and I'm going to go through these to know how this is working. This, for example, this GL integration batch size, you define a number here within GoldFinch. If you're not using the GoldFinch accounting app, you can have the system kind of batch create entries that would then be passed over to another accounting app, be it Accounting Seed or QuickBooks, or you can kind of batch into information. So we just have a default size of how many lines are going to be in the batch until basically the batch gets posted and sent across. And then it'll just create a new batch. We have here a couple other defaults that are working within the system as you're working. This is a default new lines to insert. What this means, every time you create a new order, for example, a sales order, you say, I'm going to insert lines. This is just the number of lines that's going to automatically show up. You can have 5, you can have 10. We default it to 5. This usually seems like a good number, but of course it depends on the client, what number you're going to be utilizing. We also have a place here where you can define the default days that goods are going to be shipped or received, either on the sales side or the purchase side. So this is just a default number. You can have specifics on your items. If you want specific number of days that you're going to receive the goods in, you can define that. But this is just going to be an overall default that's going to be utilized until you set up specific item information. And you also have here a default lot days to expire. And this is when you're entering a new lot, what's the default expiration date of that lot? So those are just kind of default numbers that are utilized within the system. Now we have a couple of options that we can select here. This do not allocate, which you'll learn more about allocations through when you go through the sales side. But when you place a sales order for a customer, you'll allocate inventory to that sales order. By default, it'll automatically allocate inventory, but you can check this flag off here if you don't want to automatically allocate. And then there's also an option here to use a product configurator. And that is an option that you have when you're doing the numbering sequence for inventory items as they're being entered. You can have the system just numerically number them, or you can use kind of like a smart numbering system where you can set up a configurator. So when you create a new item, you select a couple options, and then within those options, the item number will be created. We also have here a default GL ledger. You can have multiple ledgers. If you only have one, you're not going to have any default GL ledger. This setup and this configuration for this instance just has one ledger. So we're not going to have any default ledger. Everything's going to go to one GL ledger. And then we have over here on the right, we have just default setups, default units of measure, default warehouse, default currency, payment terms. All of these are defaults that are utilized when you're entering new transactions. So if there's not anything specified, for example, for a customer, if they don't have a specific warehouse that they'd like to use, this would be the default warehouse when you're entering a sales order. So again, just keep in mind, a lot of this is default setup. You can always override it as you're working through with different specific information. We have here max formula levels that has to do with manufacturing and how many bills of material breakdowns you're going to be going down. And then we also have a barcode generator. This is the basic default barcode generator. You can have different ones, but generally, this is the one that's being utilized. And then we have a couple other options here, which says default put away on sales unit of measure. Basically, when you're going to be putting away goods, once you receive goods in and you put them away, you can set up that it's going to default to your sales unit of measure that's set up on your item. So as you receive goods, you can have it automatically break down to a specific unit of measure, even if you receive it in a different unit of measure. And then in this section here, we have a lot of enabling features that can be enabled or can be disabled. And depending on your system and how you're going to configure it, you may or may not want to check these off. We have landed costs. This is really how the landed costs are going to be assigned. You can do either actual landed cost or estimated landed cost. Those are the two options that you have. And you can define whether or not, this is how you're going to define which landed cost you're going to be utilizing. We also have an option where you can enter a general ledger account number directly onto a sales invoice or a purchase invoice. You can either enable that or disable that so that you can only enter items, or you can enter general ledger account numbers. And this again depends on the company setup and the company structure, if they're going to allow people to enter that information. And then we have this accounting section. And this is a lot of the setup here is going to be, this must be set up in order to use the system at all, which there's first these date ranges. We have allow posting from and allow posting to. This is going to be kind of how you would close years, right? We're not doing any actual closing of a year or closing of a month process, but this date range here is set up to say you can only post within this date range. So if I put in a transaction that's in January of 2027, the system will not allow me to post the transaction. It'll throw up an error message. So this is very useful in your year-end and your month-end processing, so that you can define the actual date ranges. Like once you close a month, you're going to change this allow posting from so that no users can post back into that specific month. Now, this is for company-wide information. There are ways that we can get specific for specific users, but as long as the user isn't set up specifically, this is the date range information that they're going to be utilizing. And then we have here a couple other settings, which just is we're going to use. There's a couple different date functions on the sales invoice and the purchase invoice. And here, this is just default setting, whether we're going to use the same date or different, or if we're going to allow for different dates by default. But then the rest of this information you can see here, these are all general ledger account numbers. So this is the base setup for when any accounts receivable happens. This is the accounts receivable general ledger account number. And this is the AP general ledger account number, and so on and so forth. As all different transactions happen, these are the general ledger account numbers that are going to be pulled. Anything that you see here for anything that's specific, this means that you can only have one general ledger account number. So we can only have one accounts receivable general ledger account number that's set up. That's going to default. All customers are going to post to this general ledger account number. So you could see here different inventory accounts based on if you're using manufacturing, what different variances you would use for capacity, etc. And then along with that, we do have a couple other kind of default fields. We have prepayments, and that when going over the prepayment functionality, we would come back to the setup. But this will allow for prepayments and kind of how everything's going to function. You have a default bank account so that when you process your payments or receive cash in, this is going to be your default, your gains and loss general ledger account number. Not all of these fields have to be populated, but if you're going to use them, like for example, if you're going to use foreign currency, you need an exchange gain or loss account in here. This particular org isn't set up with foreign currencies, but because it's not set up with foreign currency, we don't need to have a general ledger account number in here. Okay, so this is just the basic setup here. So here we have your more asset kind of accounts, right? Anything above the line. Then we also have account posting setups. So this will only handle down here some of the general ledger transactions, but we have here account posting setups that you would define to handle the sales and cost of goods sold sides of the transactions. And for sales and cost of goods sold and different purchasing accounts, you can have multiple general ledger account numbers specified. And this is a whole big matrix that will work off of anything that's defined on the account, which we have an account posting group here that can be defined on the actual account, the customer or vendor account. We have an item posting group that can be defined on the item, or you can also specify for specific items. So within this matrix, these three fields, the combination of these will define what general ledger account number you're going to use for your sales and your cost of goods sold. So in here, you can play with this and you can have multiple sales accounts. See here, for this particular setup, for the basic, this is the basic setup. All transactions are going to be here if they're not part of these exceptions. We'll post to this 4,000 product revenue general ledger account number. In this line, there's an item specified. So if you have this particular item, it's going to post to a different set of general ledger account numbers. This matrix right here, this account posting setup, is very important to understand how it works so that when you post transactions, you know what general ledger account number it's going to post to. You can have, for example, one line in the account posting setup, or you might have a company with multiple revenue accounts and multiple cost of goods sold accounts. So you would have many, many lines here and different configurations. As you're working through, there probably will be a lot more questions about the account posting setup. You really have to, to work with it and see how everything's going to be posting. But this is a lot of, you want to make sure that you spend time and learning how the posting setups work and in your different, like I said, you can have different variables with groups of items, groups of customers, item-specific information. So this can be, it's pretty deep to get this account posting setup cleared up. So that's what I wanted to go through here. That's the basic setup. There are a couple other things that can be set up. For example, we do have an option for accounting variables. And this is a way to subset your general ledger accounts so that not only can you post to a general ledger account, you can also have a variable in there. Generally, this can be utilized for different departments. So you can have on the expense side, you can have different departments posting to, for example, an office product general ledger account number. And then the different variables will allow you to break down when you're reporting to not only see, what the expenses are in total, but you can also break it down so you can see what the expenses are for the sales team and what the expenses are for the accounting team and what the expenses are for the admin team and marketing team and all of your different departments. Of course, you can use variables other ways than just departments, but that's usually the most common use of it. And that's, how it's, it's easiest to explain and you can see how the departments can be used for that. Or different, you can also use it for different costing centers or however you want to set it up. But again, it's just a breakdown of the general ledger account number for reporting. All right, so that's the company setup, the basic company setup. This is always where you want to start. And of course, as you're working through the system, things might be turned on, turned off, and in the company setup is where you want to do that. From the company setup, we also have a specific user setup. Now, keep in mind, I told you these date ranges that you have here, the allow posting from and allow posting to, this is company specific. If I go into user setup, we can have a couple specific user setups that can be done. One of those is posting dates. So I can say for this user, I can allow different posting dates. So for this user, maybe you might want to make it more stringent, or oftentimes for those doing accounting work while you're in the process of closing out a prior month, you don't want anybody else posting to that month, but you might want accountants working in the system to allow posting into a prior month. And that's where this would be utilized. So you can have specific date ranges for people. There's also in here in the user setup, there's different permissions that a specific user can have. This one permission is to allow users to unpost transactions. And unposting transactions will mean anytime you post any transaction in GoldFinch, there's always an option to unpost it, which will just reverse everything that's happened. So a user needs to have permission in order to do that. And that's where that's set up. We also have the ability to take a sales order off of hold and the ability to delete a sales order. So these are specific permissions that you can give users outside of the standard Salesforce permission set. These are more functional. You also, for a user, can have default information. So we can have a default warehouse or a purchasing agent. This is utilized for supply plan management. So you can define these things for a specific user, what the ledger is, any account variables. What we also have, if a user is printing checks out of GoldFinch, and I know that this is more of a US thing, but if anybody's actually going to be printing checks, you can have the printing check alignment here set up. So maybe, people have different printers, they would have their checks aligned differently. But if you're going to be printing checks out of GoldFinch, you need to have the user set up. And then you would utilize this to kind of align the check printing a little bit more. All right, so that's your user setup that you can specify for all users or specific users within the company. What I would recommend as you're going in and starting an implementation with someone, you always set yourself, whatever user you're using, to have these options to be able to do at least these 3 functions, so that you know that you can go in and unpost and you can do all these things. So the admin users generally at least have these selected. The next thing I'm going to go to is numbering series. We just have numbering series set up for all different transactions that happen. You would define what numbering series is going to be utilized. When you first load in the system, these are all the default series that are set up. For example, a sales invoice is going to have the prefix SI with a dash as a separator, and this is the last number used. So it's all just going to continue to number sequentially. So for invoices, sales orders, purchase side, any transactions even that you're going to be processing, this is just the basic numbering series setup. Just another setup, currency code. If you're using currencies, you're going to want to define multiple currencies in here. If you do have a client using multiple currencies, it's recommended to turn on the Salesforce multi-currency functionality. But then in here, you would just define what the currency codes are that you're going to be utilizing. And this is the GoldFinch currency code that you're going to be added onto all the different transactions. Now I'm going to go into warehouses. You can have multiple warehouses set up. This is just where your inventory is going to be. A warehouse in GoldFinch terms, I've used different places, could be considered a location, but generally it's a physical place, a physical building where your goods are held. So we have this one warehouse set up. Within each warehouse, you can have multiple bins. So here we have the main location of this warehouse called main, but then within there, we have multiple bins that specify different locations within that building. So if you have, and it's a breakdown of actual locations. So you can have multiple warehouses. Within each warehouse, you can have their own subset of bins that are defined. And here, how we have the setup, you can have specific bins defined for different transactions. So any goods, so when goods are shipped out or received in or returns are processed or different production, these are all production from work orders, can be utilized in its own bin. So you would specify what bin is going to be used for different functionality. You can see here we have one bin, this pick bin, that's going to be used to ship goods out, to receive goods in, and also when goods are returned. We're going to be using that same bin. So you can use the same bin for all of them. If they're only, if they're not utilizing multiple bins, you just have one bin set up for everything. But if you do want to have multiple bins, you would define what bin in here based on the process. Then I'll move on to a couple other things that you can define within the bin, within the warehouse itself. So you can set up per warehouse what you want to have happen during different functions. So for example, we can say we're going to bypass the pick for shipments. That means that we're just going to process a shipment and we're not going to create a pick ticket. We're not going to pick goods out of different bins to then be sent out. So here are options that you can do. For example, automatically populate the lots when you're creating a shipment, or you can do that manually. We can auto create a put away. We have this option to enable pick tickets on work orders. So when a work order is generated, we can create a pick ticket so they can go into their bins and pick what goods are needed to produce that item. And then a couple default, we can default blank for put away. Basically, when you're putting away into a bin, you don't want the system to define it. You're going to define it by each user. We have a couple things here for demand planning. If you're going to be utilizing the demand planning forecast or different setups that's going to happen to facilitate the supply demand planning functionality. We also in GoldFinch have an option to create bills of ladings from shipments that are going out. And here are just some fields that need to be populated that will be printing on the bill of lading by warehouse. So depending on what warehouse is being utilized, you're going to have different information here. This is where you just set up those bills of lading information. And I'm going to scroll up here to kind of the related lists. When you're looking at transactions that happen into a warehouse and any inventories received and shipped out and things are happening, adjustments are made, anytime any transaction happens, a bin content is going to be populated, or anytime any transactions happen with an inventory item. Bin content entries are created. I'm just going to view this here. So for this warehouse, there's a combination of each item, unit of measure, item lot, and bin will calculate to give you the quantity in that configuration. So for this item, in the unit of measure of each, in the bin pick, there are 100 of these items, 100 eaches in the inventory right now. And this is always current time, right? It doesn't do any calculations based on any date in the screen. But you can see here as things post and things are processed, you're going to have all of these bin contents. So here you can come and see what the status is of any inventory item. It'll always hold your lot numbers here if items are lot tracks and what bin the item is in. So this is the best place to find your quantity on hand and where your inventory is sitting. Okay, I'm going to go back here. There's some other information here that you can see, but we're going to look at that on the item specific as well. So kind of this duplicate information, but I'm just going to see the ledger entries when we're actually on the items. Before we get to the items, there's a couple other little setups that would be done. There's shipping agents. So when you go to ship goods or you're receiving goods in, you have all of your different shipping agents, how you're going to transport the goods and how you're going to request that the goods are transported to you. A couple other things, shipping agents, this is just where you come in, there's a code that you're going to be setting up. Item categories can be defined onto your actual inventory items. So you can categorize your items if you'd like by using this item category page. We have payment terms here. This is where you define the payment terms, either the sales side of the payment terms or the purchase side of the payment terms. They're all held here. And what you would do is you set up your payment terms, whatever code and description you'd like. And if there's any sort of discount being taken, for example, the 210 net 30, we're going to say that there's a 2% discount. What the discount date calculation, which in this case is 10. So within 10 days, if a customer pays you within 10 days, you're going to be giving them a 2% discount. And then we have the total due date calculation. All of this, though, the entire invoice is going to be due in 30 days. So with this setup, you can set up all of your different payment terms. And like I said, again, the sales side and also the purchase side. There are a couple other fields here that can be defined on the payment terms, basically bypassing AR. If you're using another accounting system, you can bypass AR. We can define different general ledger account numbers and a prepayment percentage if you're utilizing prepayments, which there's a function in GoldFinch that you can set up prepayments for any sales order or any purchase order. And that's just defining the prepayment percentage. So there are a few things. These can be used on different situations, and circumstances, depending on how you're using the system. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into items. And item setup, items are either inventory items that hold inventory, or I'm just going to look at this item type, or they can be service items. Service items can be sold and they can be purchased, but they don't hold inventory. So you're just going to be utilizing this on for example, this outside service. It's not an item, but you're going to be charged for it. So that might be on a purchase order that you can define, an outside service. But it's going to be set up in the same object as the inventory items that do hold inventory. All right, so I'm going to open up this one item and look at all the different options that we have. First and foremost, when you're setting up an item, you can have multiple units of measure. So you can see here, I've set up 2 units of measure for this one item. It can either be sitting in a case or as an each. And then I have a conversion rate that's entered here. So basically it's saying, so for every key each, there's one, or for every case is 12 eaches, right? And you can have as many units of measure as you'd like for one item, but you just want to make sure that you define the unit of measure and define the conversion. Within here, within the units of measure, you can also have a weight specified what an each is versus what a case is. So that it'll separate that. And then you can just here, we have the quantity on hand for each unit of measure, what's been allocated on any sales order or any transfer order, and then the total quantity available here. So you're going to be able to see per item, per unit of measure, what your actually inventory has on hand at this time. All right, and as you're processing sales and purchases, you're going to define each different unit of measure. So a couple other things when setting up your item, I'm just going to go on to the edit here. You have an item type, which again is very important. It's either inventory or service, whether it's holding inventory or if it's just a service item and just basically a charge and it doesn't hold inventory, you would have it be set up as a service. Another important field is the inventory class. It's either going to be a finished good inventory, a subassembly, or a raw material item. These are different characterizations for each item, but this also goes back, I'm just going to open this up, into what general ledger account number is going to be hit when any transactions happen to this item. So we can see here we have the finished good inventory general ledger account number, the subassembly, and the raw material. So dependent on this field on each item, this is going to define what general ledger account number is going to be hit when anything transacts with that item. And then we have a couple other fields here where you can have different brands and you can have different specifications for your item. We can also by the item define whether the item is lot tracked or not. If the item is lot tracked, every transaction for that item must have a lot associated with it. We have options of how the lots are going to be picked. It's either going to be on first expiration, first out, first in, first out, or we can pick lots based on the bin ranking. So how different bins are set up in your warehouse. By default, it's always first expiration, first out. That's generally what we see. So that's going to be the default whenever you're setting up a new item. And then we have, according to the lots, we have lot days to expire. Like we saw before, the default is 365, but if this particular item is different, we can change the lot days to expire here, and that'll just be utilized whenever anything gets transacted upon. We have here again, dealing with the lots, we have here minimum days to expire when picked, which this can determine that if you only want to pick items that are going to expire within 14 days, like once 14 days hits, you're not going to be selling that item anymore. You would put in here minimum days to expire when picking. So if something's going to expire within 14 days, the system will not suggest that you pick this item because it's about to expire. And it's not going to allow you to pick that item. A couple other options here for tax group, which we do sales tax calculations. And that's a whole other matrix of what the actual calculation is going to be. But part of that is defined by the tax group. We can have specific what type of item this item belongs to based on, and that's going to clarify how it's going to be calculating sales tax. All right, and then we have an option for blocked. All of our master records, you can block items, which means that you can't post any transactions. So if an item is no longer in use, you could block the item. So if anybody goes to use it by mistake or sells an item, it won't allow you to if the item is blocked. And then non-sellable, you can just check this off. This is just a checkbox defining if the item is non-sellable for any reason. And then I'm going to come down here, and here we have 3 different unit of measure fields that are going to be filled in for each item. First, we have the base unit of measure, and that is how all inventory is seen. All items need to have a base unit of measure specified, and that's basically your inventory unit of measure can't think of the right word. But as you go through the system, everything is going to be calculating depending on, it doesn't matter how the unit of measure is sitting in your inventory, but it's going to calculate and give you a quantity of your base unit of measure. So for example, here we have quantity base on hand. So this is, even though we have inventory for this item in eaches and we also have it in cases, this is going to use that conversion field and calculate what the base quantity on hand is in eaches. That's our base unit of measure. So you're going to see base a lot, like here, remaining quantity base, and bin content. A lot of things are going to be defined by base unit of measure, which that in this case for this item is going to be each. It's always going to calculate up. And then we can also define on the sales unit of measure what the standard sales unit of measure is. It's not mandatory. This is just the default. And the purchase unit of measure. So by default, you're generally going to be purchasing this item in cases. All right. And then we have a few other fields here. We can define a preferred vendor if you'd like. Country of origin, the pick list that you can just, define per item. It's not mandatory. And then we have some landed cost calculation fields here. If you are doing a percentage-based landed cost calculation, you can enter the percentage in here. And you would set up, we have 5 different options. You would just set up what that landed cost is. Like, for example, maybe freight or duty or insurance. You would just adjust the labels accordingly. And then over here, like we looked at a bit, these are all just calculation fields and where the inventory is on all base unit of measure. And you can see what you have on hand and what the total value is of this item currently in inventory. We also have here an expected value. How GoldFinch works is when you're processing shipments and receipts of inventory and you're posting those transactions, you're not hitting the general ledger. You have a cost associated, for example, with goods that you're receiving in, you have an expected cost. So you're going to see an expected value that still hasn't been posted to the general ledger. So this is when you first receive goods in, you're going to have an expected value. But then when you actually process the invoices, you're going to have a true value. So once you process that vendor's invoice and they give you the true cost, that's when the inventory is going to be updated with that cost and the general ledger account number is going to be affected. So just keep in mind, and as you go through other transactions, as you're transacting on the sales and the purchase side, when you're receiving goods in and you're shipping goods out, you're not going to be affecting the general ledger until the invoice in both those scenarios are actually posted. But your inventory is going to be adjusted. If you bring goods in or ship goods out, you're still going to be affecting the value of the inventory and the quantity on hand. So just when the invoice is actually processed, that's when everything's going to really be trued up. So you could have an expected value here of goods that have been received, but you just haven't posted the invoices yet. And then we have the default warehouse. This is, again, just the default for this item that this is generally going to be set in. And you can also have, this is just a text field where you can define a default shelf for this particular inventory item. Now we have here costing section of the item. You're going to define the costing method, either FIFO costing or standard costing we support. Here, this is a calculation field. This is going to give us an average cost based on the inventory that you currently have on hand. What is the average cost of each unit? And then we have a last invoice based cost. And this is the last cost, the last time this item was purchased, this is the cost it was purchased at. So this number can fluctuate as different purchase orders are being received. It's always going to be changing to the last invoice cost. And then we have here an item posting group, which we saw this in the setup of the account posting setup. So you can define items, group items together in a specific item posting group and to transfer over to that account posting setup to define what sales general ledger account number and what cost of goods sold general ledger account number is going to be utilized when any item within a specific posting group is going to be posted. It's not a mandatory field, can be left blank, but this is only going to be if you're going to be grouping for general ledger reasons. And here we have standard base cost is populated, the standard price is populated, and it'll give you just a profit for each item specifically. A couple of fields here for manufacturing. If you are doing manufacturing, you can do, we support batch manufacturing or discrete manufacturing. So if it is batch, you would check that off here. And if you are doing batch manufacturing, you would just define the batch unit of measure in here. There's some different tolerances that will allow you so that if you are outputting, what it'll allow you a tolerance. So it's not a one-for-one relationship. So it will give you some flexibility if you're not consuming the exact amount that's defined in the setup. We also have a place here for purchase order tolerance percentage. If you're going to allow your vendor to send you more than you've put on your purchase order, you can just put in a percentage tolerance here. So for example, if you're going to say we allow a 10% overage for this item on the purchase receipt, you can enter that in there. And then you don't have to adjust the purchase order if your vendor did happen to send you more. We'll just allow you to process. All right, and then we have this low-level code here. This is the calculation field utilized for manufacturing if you have multiple levels of bills of materials. It will allow you, it just kind of gives you what the lowest level code here is, and it helps calculate information. We have some setup here for catch weight, if it is a catch weight item, and what tolerance percentage you're going to allow. We have a work center here, which is utilized for manufacturing. If you do have different work centers, you would define them as items. So you would define a work center in here as a service item, and you would just check off that it's a work center or if it's an outside service. You can enter different information here, calculate for capacity reasons for when you're processing your manufacturing. We have here item-specific information for a bill of lading. Again, we do create bills of lading from the system, and you can enter your bill of lading information, and this will just print on the document. And then we also have some planning requirements here. This is an important field. It's your replenishment system. You can either purchase an item, or you can define that an item is purchased or that it's a work order item. If your item is a purchase item, you can only purchase it. You can only put it on a purchase order. If you define that an item is being replenished via a work order or production work order, the item then can go onto a work order, but it can also be purchased as well. So purchase, again, is only purchase. Work order, you can purchase or put it on a work order, either of them. And here we have some parameters that you can set up for your planning. So you can have a reorder quantity or a safety stock can be entered in here. That will help you when you do your supply planning and help with the calculations. All right, so those are those different groups of settings for the items. And we'll move on to a couple other setups that you can have for your items. You can have cross-references. Let's open this up here. What a cross-reference is you can define, depending on your accounts, either the customer's item number or a vendor's item number. So here, this, for example, this Dickinson Place, this is a customer account that we have set up. We have it set up as this is the customer's item number. So when the customer calls in and orders this item number, you can enter this item number onto a sales order. The system will go through the cross-references and put your item number onto the sales order. Conversely, on the purchase side, if this was a purchase, this guy is set up as a vendor. So whenever we enter a purchase order for this item, we can have the vendor's item number print on documents so we can send that out to the vendor. All right, and you can have multiple cross-references often, for all different customers that you sell it to. They can have their own item number defined in here. All right, and then from here, we also have sales price set up. So we have a standard price here on the item, $25, but you can have multiple different price structures set up. I look at this, so within this year, for this year, they're going to have a special, if you order a minimum of 10 the price then is reduced from $25 each to $23.50 each. So you can have a lot of different pricing in here based on the date range. It's always going to be based on the date ranges. So if you have new pricing structures set up, you can define all of that in here based on the date ranges. You can also define per account or per customer. So if you have special pricing for specific customers, you can have them set up here to have their own special pricing. So we have sales pricing for the sales side, and then we also have purchase pricing for the purchase side. So I have set up here, if we purchase from this vendor and we purchase cases, the unit cost is going to be $10 per case or $10 per unit. So that's just going to override the standard pricing for this item whenever we purchase from this particular vendor. So those are basic pricing structure. We also have here this formulas and routings. This all has to do with bills of materials or for production items. So this is where you set up, you can have different formula versions. So basically different versions of an item you can specify. You don't have to, but you can have different versions. And here you would define what the bills of materials are. So what items comprise that item and different routing options. So if you're producing this item on a production work order, it's going to say this is the components you need and the quantity and the unit of measure, everything set up here. But then we're also going to have different routings. So these are all things that are going to have to happen. You're going to be mixing items and you're going to be packing items. So all of this has to do with, it flows over to the production work orders. But we call them formulas and routings in GoldFinch. Formulas or bills of materials. Those are kind of interchangeable names that's been utilized. But this is the basic setup. Once you get into more manufacturing, you'll come into this more in depth to see the actual transactions, how they work, and how the setup works. All right, so that's the basic setup of each item. We also have a couple other related lists. Here we have transactions where you can see any sales that this item's ever been on, any purchases for this item, and any work orders for this item. These are just related lists going back to these other objects, which really, for the most part, sales, purchases, and work orders is where your items are going to be utilized. And then we also have ledger entries here. And ledger entries will hold the actual transactions. Whenever any transaction happens, there are going to be ledger entries that are going to be posted, linked to the item to hold all of the detailed information. We have here per item, we have bin content. So I'm just going to open this up. We saw this on the warehouse side, the same object, except this is just going to be filtered to this specific item. So you can see for this item what warehouse, unit of measure, lot number, and bin this item is in, and the quantity associated with each of those different options. We have everything set up here as lot. There is an option that you can also have serialized items. So you can process, instead of lots, you can also have serial numbers. Kind of work hand in hand, work the same way. So the bin content is a great place the best place to look and see what your inventory actually what the status is of each specific inventory item as it breaks down into those different unit of measure, the bin, etc. You can see here we have the quantity based on the unit of measure that's defined. And then we have a quantity base, which this is the base unit of measure, which for this item is eaches. So you can see we have 555 cases on hand, and that equates to 6,600 eaches. So it's just going to automatically do the math here based on the conversion that's been set up in the units of measure. All right, so if I go back to the item, other transactions, ledger entries that you can see, is we have actual item ledger entries. And these are all of the entries that adjust the quantity of the item. You can see here we have receipts that have been processed, adjustments, shipments that have gone out. All of these, anytime a transaction happens that changes the quantity of the item, you will have item ledger entries being created. We can also look into, I look into a specific item ledger entry. This is a receipt of inventory that's been received in. Every item ledger entry also has cost entries associated with it. So this is the cost entries is where the actual inventory value is coming from. So you can see here anything that happened. First, we received the goods in at this expected cost, and then the invoice was processed at, and here's the invoice cost. So this is where the cost of the inventory is coming from for that particular item ledger entry. These cost entries are going to be rolling up. So you're going to have cost entries on every item ledger entry that's created. So again, back to the item ledger entries, this is just everything that's happened to this item. We also have warehouse entries, which is everything that happened in the item ledger entry, you're also going to create a warehouse entry. The warehouse entry has to do with the bins. So we're going to have different warehouses based on where the item is within each bin. So as you receive goods and you have adjustments, all of this warehouse entries are going to be created. But there are also additional entries that are going to be created when bin movement happens. So when you move inventory from one bin to another, either putting away inventory, right? It goes through a put away, or picking tickets could be here too, or also movements of warehouse of bins, movements of bins, a warehouse entry is going to be created. So the warehouse entry is just a more detailed entry of the item ledger entries, and just kind of where within each bin, if there's something happened within a bin movement, then a warehouse entry is going to be created. But as you're looking at the ledger entries, the main transactions happen for these item ledger entries, and that's where all of your costs are going to be associated with. They're going to be associated with your item ledger entries. But sometimes warehouse entries, if you're moving from one bin to another, you're not making any changes in different costs. Okay, so those are the basic transactions of the items. All right, one other thing that I did want to show based on items is you can, where you see all of the transactions, right? We have different reports, so you can see the quantity on hand, where the inventory is. We have the bin management for each item or for each warehouse. We also have this availability status. There's different windows, these item availability windows that you can utilize. But the item availability status, I'll just look at. This is one place that you can go and kind of see all information combined together. So you can see all of your items listed here. There's some filtering that you can do here and different calculations. So you can see what you actually have on hand for each item and unit of measure, what's been allocated, what's on sales order, different forecasts, what's on a work order and what's on purchase order. So it takes all of this information and combines it together so that you can see what you actually will have based on a date. Or if calculations happen and you don't have enough inventory to fulfill anything that's on a sales order, this is the best place to look so that you can see all of your different quantities and where the inventory actually is. So this is very helpful to look at this and to get to know this page. And it also shows you, all of the transactions. So you can see where everything actually is, and you can drill down and look and see the transactions to see where it comes up with all of the numbers of why it's actually available, what's available for inventory. All right, and of course, there are a lot of other reports and all of that dealing with inventory and availability, but this I think is the nicest place to look, which I'm not going to go through all of the different reports right now. The next thing I'm going to go to really quickly is accounts. And GoldFinch uses Salesforce's standard accounts. We use this for customers and also for vendors. You can see here we have a customer number that's assigned. This is a GoldFinch field, and vendor numbers, another GoldFinch field. So that you can have different customer numbers if they're coming from a legacy system, or if you have a client who just likes to use customer or vendor numbers, you can certainly have those as well. So I'm just going to open up the account page. There's some added things. There are some here, this GoldFinch ERP section. There are different items that have been added to the account, right? We have some contact information, who's your ordering contact or billing contact. And this utilizes the standard Salesforce contact structure and objects. We have here what are the customer's payment terms, a default warehouse, currency code, tax area, credit limit can be defined. Basic information, address. So this is the basic information about the accounts. Just a few other fields. These are all default fields. So whenever this account is used on a sale or a purchase, these are the default information this is the default information that comes over, which of course, once you're working within the system and are actually posting the transactions and posting the sales and purchases, those can always be changed. The defaults can be changed as you're working through. But really here, this is where we have just some GoldFinch items. Everything else with the account is the same, right? Because it's just a Salesforce, standard Salesforce accounting page. I mean, Salesforce account object. So just keep in mind when I'm using account, customers and vendors are all held within the same object.